Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bible study from Dinuba Presbyterian Church. It's great to be back with you after taking a week off last week due to the busyness of Christmas Eve. The season of Advent is now over, and I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas with your loved ones and your family and your friends celebrating the birth of Jesus. As we wrap up 2023, we're concluding this series of studies that we've called Keep Church Weird. We've been looking at the ways in which Jesus' church has been called to be different from the ways of the world, to be distinct in the ways in which we think and we live and we act. This is our calling, but it's not something that happens by default. As the church, both individually and corporately together, we must make the decision every day, sometimes every hour, to follow the way of Jesus and resist the ways of the world. Previously in this series, we've looked at the call of the church to be dead to self, to be content, and peaceful, and forgetful. This list is not meant to be exhaustive by any means, so please don't take it as a complete treatment of everything that Jesus' church is called to do and to be. But with that said, this week we're wrapping up our series with a look at another way in which the church is to be distinct from the world. The church is called to be salty. Now, I hasten to add that by salty, I do not mean the particularly acerbic or sarcastically confrontational way that we tend to use the term in modern usage. A real housewife style of saltiness is not really what we have in view, just to avoid any confusion. Instead, we're examining a particular phrase that Jesus used in the Sermon on the Mount and considering its implications for how we, as Jesus' church, should be weird from the world's perspective. A bit over 2 years ago, we did a series of studies on the Sermon on the Mount, so if you happen to be with us in person at the church for that study in the fall of 2021, some of this material may be familiar to you, but I trust you'll bear with me. The Sermon on the Mount is the largest continual block of Jesus' teaching that has been preserved for us in the New Testament, though the title for this block of teaching doesn't exist anywhere within the text itself. Augustine came very close when he called it the sermon that our Lord Jesus Christ spoke on the Mount, which I think is close enough to give him full credit for coining the term, but I digress. During the first 300 years of the church's existence, there was no passage of scripture that was more often quoted, analyzed, and explicated in the teaching of the church than this sermon. It was a vital, central, and indispensable text during that time, especially prior to the completion of the canonization process. But over the succeeding centuries, the sermon has receded a bit in Christian thought and teaching. We still quote component parts of the sermon quite often, especially the Beatitudes, but the sermon itself is rarely taught or discussed as a cohesive whole. But this teaching does offer us great insight into what Jesus is saying to us, since it's framed within the text as a kind of introductory discourse for the curious crowds to get to know Jesus and discover what he's all about. To demonstrate this, let's pick up in Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, as we run up toward the portion of the text where Jesus mentions the saltiness that I promise we are going to talk about. And he, that is Jesus, went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures, and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. Jesus begins the sermon with several surprising ideas that were contrary to dominant thinking of the age. He says that those who are mourning, those who are overlooked, those who are persecuted by authorities are blessed, meaning that those caught up in those circumstances should be happy. This is reinforced in verse 12 when Jesus tells those who are being slandered to rejoice and be glad, and promises that God sees their situation, knows their actions and their hearts, and that he will reward them for their faithfulness. He describes the character of his people and the future church in ways that should sound familiar to us as we have moved through the series. Humble, meek, merciful, peacemaking, qualities that seemingly of necessity will mean that the wider culture and the powerful elites of the time will react against them, even with violence. So in this introductory message, this kind of Jesus 101 teaching that he gives the crowd that has started to follow him around, Jesus doesn't give us a feel-good, self-help, candy-coated Pollyanna message. Jesus tells us that being his disciple will necessarily mean opposition from the world, because, after all, the world will find us weird. And as the old saying from Ecclesiastes says, there is nothing new under the sun. Such opposition to the ways of God has been the case since the beginning because of the broken and sinful nature of humanity. But crucially, critically, in the midst of all of this, Jesus tells his people to rejoice and be glad. Being weird is not supposed to make us dour or bitter. It should not harden our hearts or make us cold and cruel. On the contrary, following the way of Jesus should make us a people of joyful thanksgiving. And Jesus follows this command by telling us that we are to be salty. Now, a common interpretation of this idea of the church being the salt of the earth, and one you've probably heard in sermons and in teaching, is based on the use of salt as a preservative for food. Modern technology has given us numerous ways we can preserve food, both chemically and environmentally. But in the first century, salt was the premier method for preventing food from spoiling and creating long-term storage for perishable commodities. No doubt the fishermen among Jesus' disciples and in his audience during the Sermon on the Mount would have been very familiar with this use for salt. And the common exegesis here is that the activity of the church will have a similarly preservative impact on the world. The church's faithful service to the world helps to stem, if not entirely staunch, the tide of decay, wickedness, and societal collapse on our planet. This is a pretty sweeping macro-level viewpoint, and I do think that there is certainly truth that a healthy church community will uplift, restore, and ennoble its surrounding neighborhood. But I don't think that's quite the idea that Jesus has in mind here in the Sermon on the Mount. As important as salt was for its preservative properties in the first century, it was still used for the same important reason that we use salt today. It tastes good. Now, among the many blessings of being married to Pastor Chelsea has been learning from her vast and versatile culinary knowledge and ability. She is an extremely skilled cook and doesn't just understand what to do in preparing a dish, but also understands why it should be done that way. And though I do not have her refined palate by any means or even quite the same taste for salt as she does, I have learned from her that just the right sprinkling of salt can enliven the flavors on a plate, lifting them up and bringing them a vibrancy that they couldn't achieve on their own, and making it impossible to say no to that next bite. Put another way, salt makes food attractive to our senses. And I think that's the use of salt that Jesus has in mind in the sermon. The gladness and joyfulness he calls his disciples to express and to embody, even when under heavy opposition from the world, cannot help but be attractive to those on the outside of the Christian faith and looking in. Seeing true love, kindness, honor, optimism, peace, and hope in the face of those in hardship will make a significant impression on those we encounter, because they will see us in all of the things that they want in their lives, because we too wanted those same things in our lives before we came to faith. Without this saltiness, our faith can disintegrate into just a collection of doctrines and regulations and archaic knowledge. If we lose our saltiness, we will be dull, combative, and suspicious to those around us, and the true brilliance and luster of our faith will be hidden. This was one of Jesus' prominent criticisms of the most popular Jewish religious teachers of his day, the Pharisees, who had built a very learned, very regulated, but ultimately quite lifeless faith that became a burden for the people instead of lightening their load and kindling the joy of knowing God. They just weren't very salty. As Jesus' disciples, the church is called to maintain its saltiness, to remind itself of the excitement and joy that we have because of what Jesus has done for us. If we become embittered or tired or numb, we will lose our saltiness, and those who have not yet come to faith will see very few reasons to pursue it when they look at our example. But if we maintain our saltiness, allowing it to be sprinkled over every part of ourselves, we can show the world that Jesus is worth following. We are called to be a salty church. Thank you for joining us on this series of studies. It's been wonderful having you all along, and we appreciate each and every one of you. On Saturday, January 6th, at 10 a.m., we'll be meeting together in person at the church to discuss what we've looked at over the course of this series and be led in some response questions by Pastor Chelsea. So we really do hope to see you there. Again, that's Saturday, January 6th at 10 a.m. at the church. Bible study will return online here the week of February 14th to begin a new series of studies on the book of Hosea. This year, Lent begins on Valentine's Day, and the book of Hosea features one of the most fascinating, difficult, and prophetically significant love stories in all of the scriptures. It has much to say about the faithfulness of God to an unfaithful people. And I'm really looking forward to diving into Hosea with you all next month. Until then, God bless you as you begin this new year, and we'll see you next time.